The sun was beginning to set on the long stretch of highway, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple as the day slipped into twilight. Darius King, dressed in a sharp tan military uniform that clung to his broad shoulders, steered his car onto the off-ramp. A remote gas station sat perched on the edge of nowhere, its flickering neon sign barely hanging on for life, announcing, "Gas, snacks, open 24 hours." The lot was empty, the pumps silent, save for the faint hum of insects in the evening air. Darius, a tall, imposing figure in his late 20s, stepped out of his worn black sedan. His clean-shaven head and sharp features reflected a man who was always in control, a man who carried the weight of the world with quiet dignity. His hands were steady as he grabbed the fuel pump, sighing with relief. He was only a few hours from home after a grueling deployment overseas. He could already imagine the comfort of his mother's home-cooked meal and the peace of a familiar bed. The silence was comforting until the distant rumble of engines cut through it like a knife. Darius's dark brown eyes darted toward the highway. The sound grew louder, the unmistakable roar of motorcycles approaching. Within moments, a gang of bikers tore into the lot like a violent storm, their engines revving, tires screeching, and leather jackets gleaming in the dying sunlight. There were 6 of them in total, each more unruly than the next. Chrome-painted Harleys and custom bikes lined up as they parked, their riders dismounting with practiced arrogance. Leading the group was Blade Carlson, a thick-set man with slicked-back hair, a scruffy beard, and arms tattooed with snarling wolves and skulls. His black leather vest had Razorbacks MC stitched across the back, a patch of local infamy. Blade's boots clomped on the cracked pavement as he pulled off his fingerless gloves and looked around the empty lot. Darius ignored them at first, focusing on the numbers on the gas pump ticking upward. But Blade's gaze landed on him like a weight, taking note of his uniform and military insignia. A grin spread across Blade's face, one that promised trouble. He elbowed a lanky, blonde biker beside him. "Would you look at that? Looks like we got ourselves a weekend warrior," Blade said, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice sharp and mocking. Laughter erupted from the gang. Darius heard it, but didn't respond. He didn't need to. Blade wasn't satisfied. He strolled toward Darius's car, his heavy boots echoing in the otherwise silent evening. "Hey, soldier boy," Blade called out, his tone dripping with condescension. "Nice car you got there, but what's a big, tough military man doing driving a sedan? Where's your Harley? Or do you only play soldier part-time?" Darius finished fueling his car and calmly replaced the nozzle, ignoring Blade entirely. His lack of reaction seemed to infuriate the biker leader. Blade stepped closer, his gang following like a pack of wolves, sensing weakness. "I'm talking to you, hero," Blade sneered. "You deaf or something? I'm giving you a chance to redeem yourself." He gestured toward his bike. "How about a race? You against me. Show us what you're made of." Darius's calm gaze finally met Blade's. "Not interested," he said simply, his voice steady, almost soft. Blade's grin faltered, but his arrogance doubled. "What's the matter? Scared? Don't want to scratch up your fancy uniform?" Darius didn't take the bait. "I said I'm not interested. You all have a good evening." He turned back toward his car. That was when Blade's smirk turned into something darker. He tilted his head, and with a motion of his hand, the bikers began circling Darius's car. Engines roared, metal scraped, and handlebars seemed to threaten the paint with every pass. The gang whooped and hollered, making a show of intimidation. Darius's jaw tightened as he watched them taunt his car, his mother's car, the one she'd lent him for the drive home. He exhaled deeply, steadying himself, refusing to let anger take root. He'd faced far worse than these men. Blade leaned against the hood of the sedan, running a hand across its surface, deliberately smearing grease onto the clean paint. "You're being rude, soldier boy. You don't want to race, that's fine. But you owe us some respect." Darius's voice remained calm. "Step away from the car." Blade chuckled, turning to his crew. "Hear that, fellas? I think we hurt his feelings." The bikers laughed again, their jeers echoing across the empty gas station. Blade pushed off the car and stepped forward until he was face to face with Darius. Blade was shorter, but his muscular build and confrontational posture screamed aggression. He sneered, showing his yellowing teeth. You think you're better than us, don't you? Just because you got that little patch on your sleeve? Darius met his gaze without blinking. I don't think about you at all. Blade's smirk evaporated. The other bikers fell silent as the tension thickened. For a long moment, it felt like the world had gone still. Then Blade's lips curled into a malicious grin. Maybe it's time we taught you some manners. Blade raised a finger and pointed at the car, signaling one of the bikers, a burly man named Ricky, to move toward it, pulling something from his pocket. The glint of metal revealed a key, aimed at scratching the paint. That was the breaking point. Darius stepped forward, his calm expression hardening into something cold and unyielding. Stop, he commanded, his voice low but carrying an authority that silenced everyone. Blade cocked an eyebrow, feigning surprise. Or what, soldier boy? You gonna call for backup? Darius looked Blade dead in the eyes. Or you're going to regret it. Blade barked out a laugh, but there was something in Darius's posture, a predator's stillness, that gave the others pause. Ricky hesitated, his hand hovering near the car. Blade noticed and scowled. What are you waiting for? Scratch it. Before Ricky could move, Darius struck. It happened in an instant. Darius grabbed Ricky's wrist with lightning speed, twisting it hard enough to make the biker yelp and drop the key. Ricky stumbled backward, clutching his hand in pain. The rest of the bikers stiffened, their grins vanishing as they realized Darius was not someone to be trifled with. Blade's face turned red with anger. You want to fight, soldier? You just picked the wrong gang to mess with. Darius didn't flinch. I don't want to fight anyone, but I will defend myself. Blade cracked his knuckles and took a step closer, his gang fanning out behind him. The air seemed to thrum with tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Blade grinned maliciously, squaring his shoulders. Then let's see what you've got, tough guy. It's about time someone taught you a lesson. The gas station lot seemed to shrink under the weight of what was coming. The air was thick, electric, like the moment before a lightning strike. Darius stood tall, his boots planted firmly on the cracked pavement. The dying sunlight cast long shadows, and in those shadows loomed the gang, leather, chrome, and raw aggression. Blade's grin turned wolfish, his ego unwilling to back down. His voice, loud and mocking, carried over the engines that still rumbled softly. What's the matter, hero? Afraid you can't take us all on? He gestured to his gang, whose smirks had returned now that their leader was in charge. You think one little twist of the wrist makes you tough? Let's see what you do when there's no one here to save you. Darius's response was measured, his voice low and even. I don't want trouble. I asked you to step away from the car, that's all. Tank, a massive figure of a man with a shaved head and a goatee, snorted. Hear that, Blade? He's asking nice. His deep voice rumbled like gravel in a tin can. He cracked his knuckles menacingly, his thick arms flexing as he took a step forward. Darius didn't move, didn't blink. Instead, he let his words hang in the air, steady and firm. Walk away, you still can. The warning made Blade's grin falter for a second, just a second, but his pride wouldn't allow him to heed it. He nodded toward Tank. Teach our soldier boy what happens when he mouths off. Tank's smile spread into something wicked. He lumbered forward, his heavy boots thudding against the pavement as the other bikers whooped and hollered like spectators at a gladiator match. Tank's shadow engulfed Darius as he stepped closer, stopping inches away, his breath foul and hot in the cooling air. You think you're better than us, huh? Tank growled. All that training, all those little badges. He jabbed a finger at Darius's chest. But I bet you've never been hit by a real man before. Darius held his ground, his voice low. You don't want to do this. Tank's grin turned into a scowl. Oh, but I do. Before Darius could say another word, Tank swung. A massive fist arced toward his head, the force behind it enough to break bones. But Darius had seen this before, sloppy, reckless. He stepped sideways in a fluid motion, Tank's punch whizzing harmlessly past his ear. Before Tank could react, Darius grabbed his outstretched arm, twisted it sharply behind his back, and swept his leg out from under him. The move was clean, controlled, a product of years of training and discipline. Tank hit the ground hard, landing flat on his stomach with a grunt that sucked the air out of him. Darius knelt beside him, applying just enough pressure to keep Tank pinned without causing permanent harm. "Stay down," Darius ordered, his voice calm but commanding. "This doesn't have to get worse." For a moment, the gang froze, stunned by how quickly their largest member had been taken out. Tank groaned in pain, his face pressed against the pavement. Blade's smirk wavered, but his pride refused to let him back down. "What the hell are you all standing around for?" Blade barked, snapping the others out of their shock. "Get him!" Two bikers rushed forward, Ricky, the lanky blonde, and a wiry man named Slim with a face like a rat. Ricky brandished a switchblade, its blade glinting in the last slivers of sunlight. Slim grabbed a tire iron from his bike, swinging it like a baseball bat. Darius released Tank and stepped back, ready. Ricky lunged first, slashing wildly with the blade. Darius moved like water, sidestepping the attack with minimal effort. He grabbed Ricky's wrist mid-swing, twisting it until the knife clattered to the ground. Before Ricky could recover, Darius struck his midsection with a quick elbow, knocking the wind out of him. Ricky stumbled backward, clutching his ribs. Slim came next, the tire iron whistling through the air. Darius ducked under the swing, the weapon missing him by inches. He stepped into Slim's guard, grabbed the man's wrist, and delivered a sharp jab to his shoulder, forcing him to drop the weapon. Darius followed it with a sweep of the leg, sending Slim sprawling onto his back. Ricky and Slim groaned in pain, rolling on the ground as the other bikers watched in stunned disbelief. The gang, which had been so loud and confident just moments ago, was now reduced to grunts, gasps, and the sound of bodies hitting pavement. Blade's face turned crimson. "Get up, you idiots!" he shouted at his fallen crew. He turned back to Darius, his teeth grinding audibly. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a coward hiding behind tricks." Darius didn't respond. He stood tall, his breathing calm, his gaze locked onto Blade. He'd faced far worse adversaries than this gang. Blade's taunts were noise. The real threat had yet to come. Blade stalked over to his bike, yanking a crowbar from a strapped leather holster. The weapon gleamed dully in the gas station's flickering lights. He gripped it tight, white-knuckled, and turned to face Darius, his smile gone. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my crew?" Blade growled, his voice shaking with rage. "You think you're untouchable, soldier boy?" He began to advance, crowbar in hand. The others didn't follow him this time. Slim was still groaning on the ground. Ricky leaned against a pump, wheezing, and Tank hadn't moved from where Darius left him. Darius exhaled, measuring the space between them. Blade was stronger than he looked, and he had the weapon advantage now. But Darius had been in worse situations, in the dark of night, surrounded by enemies whose names he'd never know. "Put it down, Blade," Darius said evenly. "It doesn't have to end like this." Blade ignored the warning, his steps quickening, his voice rising. "You're gonna regret messing with me." Blade swung the crowbar in a wide, reckless arc. Darius ducked, the weapon slicing through empty air. Before Blade could recover, Darius surged forward, stepping inside Blade's guard. With one swift move, he caught Blade's wrist mid-swing and twisted it sharply. The crowbar fell to the ground with a heavy clang. Blade roared in frustration, his free hand swinging wildly at Darius's head. Darius ducked again, sidestepped, and brought his elbow up sharply into Blade's chin. The impact was solid, sending Blade stumbling backward. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth as he glared at Darius with a mix of fury and disbelief. For a moment, Blade just stood there, breathing hard, his hands shaking. The rest of the gang watched, silent and still. Darius straightened, his voice steady as he addressed them all. "It's over. Walk away." The quiet hung heavy. Blade stared at Darius, his eyes full of hate and humiliation. Finally, he spat blood onto the pavement and turned to his crew. "Get your bikes," he muttered, his voice low and sharp. "We're leaving." The others didn't argue. Slim limped toward his bike. Ricky helped Tank to his feet, and together they mounted up. Engines roared to life again, but the sound no longer carried the same menace as before. Blade was the last to move. He glared at Darius, his voice a low growl. "This isn't over, hero. You'll wish we never met." Darius met his gaze without fear. "Go." Blade lingered a moment longer, his pride fighting against common sense, but finally he turned away and climbed onto his bike. One by one, the Razorbacks pulled out of the lot, their roaring engines fading into the night. Darius watched them go, his heart steady. The gas station fell quiet again, the stillness returning as if the storm had never come. Cliffhanger. Darius exhaled and turned back toward his car, only to freeze mid-step. A faint sound, a single revving engine, caught his attention. He turned, and his eyes narrowed as he realized Blade hadn't gone far. The low rumble of a single engine echoed in the night, breaking the eerie calm that had settled over the gas station. Darius turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as Blade rolled back into the lot alone. The rest of the gang was gone, leaving only their leader, his pride burning hotter than the humiliation of defeat. Blade climbed off his bike, his movements deliberate. The crowbar gleamed in his hand under the flickering lights, his knuckles white as he gripped it tighter. His lip was split, and the bruise forming on his jaw made his anger even more dangerous. "You think you can walk away after embarrassing me in front of my crew?" Blade growled, his voice low but venomous. He paced forward like a predator, the crowbar dragging against the pavement with a sickening screech. "You're not so tough when you're alone, soldier boy." Darius stood still, his body calm, his breathing steady. He could see it in Blade's eyes. This wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about proving something to himself. "You don't need to do this, Blade," Darius said, his voice firm but even. "You've lost. Walk away now before you get hurt." But Blade wasn't listening. With a roar, he charged. The crowbar whistled through the air in a deadly arc, aimed at Darius's head. Darius ducked just in time, the force of the swing making Blade stumble forward. Before Blade could recover, Darius moved in, striking with precision. He grabbed Blade's wrist, twisting it slightly, just enough to make the crowbar slip. "Drop it," Darius barked. Blade snarled, twisting his body violently to break Darius's grip. The crowbar fell to the pavement with a clatter, but Blade wasn't finished. He swung with his free hand, a punch aimed at Darius's ribs. Darius absorbed the blow with a small grunt, stepping back to regain control. Blade came at him again, his fists flying in wild, desperate punches. But Darius didn't react in anger. His military training kicked in, calm, calculated, and purposeful. He blocked each hit, deflecting them with practiced ease, letting Blade exhaust himself. "You're sloppy," Darius said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You rely on anger instead of skill. That's why you lose." The taunt only fueled Blade's rage. He lunged forward, trying to tackle Darius to the ground, but Darius sidestepped and grabbed him from behind. In one fluid motion, Darius hooked his arm under Blade's shoulder and swept his legs out from under him. The larger man hit the ground hard, landing with a thud that echoed across the empty lot. Darius didn't let go. He pressed his knee against Blade's back, twisting his arm into a hold that immobilized him completely. Blade yelled out in pain, his face contorting in fury as he struggled, but he was pinned. "Stop!" Darius barked, his voice firm but controlled. "It's over. You keep fighting and you're going to leave here with a broken arm." "Let me go, you—" Blade spat through gritted teeth, writhing beneath Darius's hold. "I said stop!" Darius twisted the arm just enough to make Blade cry out again. "You're done. This is what happens when you pick fights you can't win." For a moment, there was silence, Blade's labored breathing, the faint hum of crickets in the distance. Blade finally stilled, realizing he was beaten. "You win, damn it," he spat bitterly. "Get off me!" Darius held the position a moment longer, making sure Blade wasn't going to lash out again, before finally letting him go. Blade rolled onto his back, clutching his arm and groaning in frustration. His face was red, his pride shattered. The gas station clerk, who had been peeking through the glass door, let out an audible gasp. Darius ignored him, turning his gaze to the rest of the gang, who had crept back to watch the end of the fight. Slim, Ricky, and Tank stared in stunned silence. None of them said a word, their bruised faces a mix of awe and disbelief. One of them muttered, almost reverently, Who are you?" Darius wiped a bit of sweat from his brow, his face expressionless. He glanced at Blade, still groaning on the ground, before looking back at the others. "I'm just someone who's been through tougher battles than this," Darius said simply. The words hung in the air like a challenge and a warning. No one dared to speak again. With the gang leader subdued and the rest of the Razorbacks looking defeated, Darius walked back to his car. He could still feel their eyes on him, their silence heavier than any insults they'd thrown earlier. Blade was slumped against the side of his bike, cradling his injured arm, his face twisted in shame and frustration. Darius popped open the car door, but paused when he heard a weak voice behind him. "You got lucky," Ricky muttered, his words laced with resentment. He was sitting on the curb, one hand pressed to his ribs. Darius turned, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Lucky?" he echoed, almost amused. "Is that what you think?" Ricky looked up, scowling. "Yeah, you caught us off guard." Darius chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Off guard?" He leaned casually against his car. "I used to race professionally in motocross before I joined the military. Bikes, speed, balance, that's my world." The gang froze. For a second, no one moved. Blade looked up sharply, his eyes widening. "Motocross?" he said hoarsely. Darius nodded. "Won a couple championships when I was younger. Learned how to fall, how to roll, how to move fast. Add a little military training on top of that?" He shrugged. "Well, you see the result." Slim's jaw dropped. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Darius replied with a smirk. The gang exchanged glances, their bravado evaporating completely. Ricky opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Even Blade looked like he'd been punched in the gut again, unable to deny the truth. They'd picked a fight with someone who not only outmatched them physically, but also in the very thing they prided themselves on, riding and control. Darius turned back to his car, sliding into the driver's seat. As he started the engine, the gas station clerk emerged from the building cautiously. He was a wiry young man, his face pale and wide-eyed. "Hey, man," the clerk stammered, holding up a hand to stop Darius. That was incredible. I mean..." He glanced nervously at the Razorbacks, who were still lingering like ghosts. "Those guys are trouble, but you handled them like it was nothing." Darius looked up at him, smiling faintly. "You okay?" The clerk nodded. "Yeah, thanks to you. Here." He motioned toward the pumps. "Take a free tank of gas. Least I can do." Darius hesitated for a second before nodding gratefully. "Appreciate it." As the pump hummed, Darius reflected on the absurdity of the encounter. A simple stop for gas had turned into a showdown straight out of an old Western, but he was glad for it in some strange way. It reminded him of the discipline, control, and strength he'd built over years of training, and why he had moved on from petty fights like this. When his tank was full, he slid back into the car, giving the gang one last look through the windshield. Blade was still slumped on the ground, and the others stood around him awkwardly, their reputations shattered. As Darius drove off, the Razorbacks shrank in his rearview mirror. He didn't look back again. The Razorbacks sit scattered like fallen dominoes, bruised, defeated, and silent. Slim nudges Ricky, muttering, "We messed with the wrong guy." Blade doesn't say a word. He stares at the ground, his face unreadable as the hum of Darius's engine fades into the night. Thank you for joining us on this thrilling journey of discipline, redemption, and unexpected twists. Darius's story shows us the importance of staying grounded in the face of chaos and using our skills not to dominate, but to lead. It's a reminder that battles aren't always won with brute force. They're won with patience, control, and a clear mind. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Tell us where you're tuning in from. We love connecting with listeners all around the world. And be sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss another powerful story from Hopeful Horizon. We'll be back soon with more tales that inspire, challenge, and keep you thinking long after they're over. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay resilient, and remember, sometimes the strongest move is to simply walk away.